Clear prop.
Star 73, experiencing number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear touch and go. 1 Charlie Bravo, Rakeford in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic. This week, we're tackling something we've talked about, I think, for almost the full 3 years now. And we're going to talk multi-engines, or as we like to say, behind the props. And the twin at the flight school's been real busy. You've been giving a lot of check rides, and you're working hard on training your second daughter now in the twin and another instructor. And we thought it would be timely to dive into the transition to multi-engine aircraft and talk about the things that I see as a flight school owner, we see as pilots and multi-engine rated pilots, and talk about your training experiences and your check ride experiences, and just pass on everything we can about multis, maybe a spattering of check ride things, and help those people out there that are going to tackle that multi-engine rating sooner than later. So really just going to fly off the cuff here and really dive into the learning process. And for me, as a flight school owner who offers multi-engine training, all Par 61 at UFS, it's weird how people go about it. I make recommendations every time. Hey, use the sim a lot. Make sure you know the bookwork. It's in comparison to an instrument rating or a commercial rating, the bookwork's like 25 sheets of paper compared to entire handbooks from the FAA. You don't really have to know a whole lot of book content, but you really have to become a superior pilot, in my opinion. I don't think I was a great pilot, but until I became a multi-engine pilot, just because of the two engines, and the brain has to work twice as hard, and things are happening really quick in your training because it's normally about one engine operations in that aircraft. So I don't know what the nation looks like, but let's say Houston, Texas, the average rental rate for a light twin is somewhere between $300 and $350, and a simulator is probably between $65 and $85. One of those seems very obvious than the other to practice all of your stuff. Wally, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just use $300 an hour to make the math easy. That's $5 a minute. $5 a minute. Just imagine just sitting in your living room and every minute taking a $5 bill, scrunching it up and throwing it in the garbage can. I'm not going to say you're throwing your money away, but that's the rate at which you are burning through $5 bills, one every minute.
You are throwing it away if you're sitting at the whole shoreline at David Wayne Hooks for 20 minutes. That's a smooth $100 bill. Yeah,
you are. You absolutely are. There's so much that can be done in not an airplane, whether it be in a classroom, whether it can be in your car driving down the road. I know my oldest daughter and son-in-law would be driving down the road, going through mixture, prop, throttle, maintain blue line, or whatever the drill that you learn through your instructor. But they would just quiz each other on that constantly, and the more ingrained that becomes in your mind, the more money you're going to save when you're in that airplane. And, one issue I think we have today with multi-engine training, back in the day, back in my day, to get a commercial pilot certificate, you had to have 10 hours of complex time. Complex meaning you got to have control, movable flaps, a retractable landing gear, and a controllable pitch propeller. I don't know, 5-6 years ago, the rule on that changed, that we could now use time in a technically advanced airplane. And I'm not going to get into all the definitions, but we can have a 172 that's a technically advanced airplane. We can have a Piper Warrior or a Cherokee, an Archer, whatever, that can be a technically advanced airplane. I flew in a fairly old 172 this morning doing an instrument check ride. Has been totally redone, and it's actually a very fine airplane right now. But it's an M model. M is in Mike model 172. So it's probably probably a 1976 model. So it's a 47-year-old airplane, but by definition, it's a technically advanced airplane. So what is happening is people are coming in for multi-engine training with very little complex time. They're not used to a gear. They're not used to controllable pitch propellers. Some multi-engine airplanes are going to have cowl flaps. They're certainly not used to that. I think most people are used to flaps. Most of our airplanes do have flaps. So the learning curve is steeper. They're not, again, back in my day, I was kind of used to the gear and the propeller. So I might say before you jump in, if you're going from a 172 to a multi-engine airplane, and again, most of the multi-engine airplanes do have a controllable pitch propeller. Some do not, but I haven't flown any like that, but there are some out there. It might not be a bad idea to go get some time in a Piper Arrow or a Bonanza or something like that. That's a complex airplane. Before you're spending $300 an hour, spend $200 an hour or $180, whatever those airplanes rent for.
Yeah, at our school we really preach, and we're lucky we have an Arrow, but we really preach that 10 hours for that commercial rating really should be in that complex aircraft. The TAA time does not compare to a plane that's got that prop and that gear and those movable flaps, and you become the workload gets a little bit more as you're in that complex aircraft. And if you do 10 hours in that during your commercial rating, that's 4 or 5% of your flight time throughout those 250 hours. That's a good chunk of time. And if you do 25 landings in it, you're going to not forget the gear. You're going to know what the gear horn sounds like, and what that sound's going to do to your brain. And you're going to just be a better pilot, no question. And it's going to make the transition to multis easier. I know you had a sim session yesterday at the fly school and used the sim in the multi configuration. How valuable would you say that was in comparison to being in the real cockpit?
It's gold. It is extremely valuable because we can do things in a simulator that we're not going to do in an airplane. For instance, okay, the drill that I teach for a multi-engine, if you lose an engine, mixture full forward, prop full forward, throttle through full forward, maintain blue line, flaps up, gear up, maintain blue line, identify, dead foot, dead engine, verify by pulling the throttle back of the suspected engine, feather, mixture, checklist. And every instructor is going to have maybe a variation on that. Of course, all along maintaining directional control, flying the airplane goes without saying. But we can, but we're not going to, in the airplane, we're not going to completely shut an engine down unless we're very high. And I say probably, well above 3,000 feet AGL. We're not going to completely shut an engine down. Now, we will set up zero thrust, so we will simulate feathering the engine, but we're not going to completely shut it down. Well, in a simulator, you have the luxury of being able to shut it down. I mean, completely shutting it down, feathering it in mixture. You have the luxury of doing that at 300 feet above the ground. Yeah, okay. What if we crash? Well, if we crash, we hit reset, we go back to the end of the runway, and we start all over again. That's the beauty of a simulator. The other thing we can do in a simulator is we can go bam, 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 bam. We can take off, lose an engine at a very low altitude where, as per the ACS, in a real airplane, we're not going to pull an engine below 600 feet AGL. But in a simulator, we can do it lower. So we can get a little bit more, we can push the limits a little bit more in the simulator.
I like the boom, boom, boom too, because you can literally practice that, 50 times in 50 minutes
Right.
if you wanted to, and go back
Yeah.
to the runway, reload, back to the runway, reload, back to the runway. And in an aircraft, you just can't do that. That's one of those magic secrets about the simulator is shooting approaches. You can shoot, I say, at least 6 or 7 to 1 from the airplane. I can shoot 7 approaches, ILSs in the sim versus 1 that I can do in real life because I have to fly all the way back and line up and start over. Same thing with multi-training. One real quick clarification or comment. Maybe the listeners that aren't multi-engine training rated wannabes may not know what blue line is. Can you describe blue line? I'm a multi-engine pilot, but you'll do a much better job. Describe blue line and the importance of blue line and why that's in that flow for all those that maybe haven't had any training yet.
Yeah, blue line is best rate of climb single engine. So we call it VY, which is best rate SC, single engine. Best rate of climb single engine is depicted on the airspeed indicator with a blue line. And it may not give you a climb, but it's going to give you the least descent. So let's say the airplane blue line is 85 knots. At 80 knots, you may have, I don't know, I'm just making up numbers, but maybe at 80 knots, you've got a 100-foot a minute rate of climb. At 90 knots, you may have a 100-foot a minute rate of climb. But at 85 knots, you may have a 400-foot a minute rate of climb. And, the numbers are all relative. Maybe at blue line you've got a 100-foot a minute rate of descent, but 5 knots below blue line or 5 knots above blue line, your rate of descent may be 400 feet per minute. So blue line is the speed that it's the best the airplane can do, and the best the airplane can do may not be a climb, depending on all the external factors.
And there's another thing that I remember learning was that there's a specific that gives the rudder and the air deflection mechanisms on that aircraft the ability to still control that aircraft. If you get slower than that, is there not a possibility that you could lose directional control on a single engine?
Well, that's red line. That's that's the lower one. That's VMC, and that's a different speed that we don't want to get near that. And we go up to high altitudes, and we actually do a demonstration of VMC. We kind of show how that all works. But there is a point where, you've got 2 engines, one mounted on each wing, and if one fails, the airplane is going to want to turn into the direction of that dead engine because all the thrust is coming from the other side. So we're going to use rudder to counteract that. And, rudder, the effectiveness of the rudder is proportional to the amount of air that's going over that rudder. So the slower we go, the less air going over the rudder, it loses its effectiveness. That's why, maybe in flight, the amount that you have to input the flight controls, whether it be rudder, aileron, or elevator, is minimal, but down on the approach, it's much more just because we got less air moving over it. So, that's a speed we definitely want to stay away from is the red line on the bottom end, which is called VMC, MC standing for minimum controllable.
Right. Brain fart by me, but I knew those 2 lines were important and we should call those things out for the listeners. So you're in the sim. That's another thing that you just would never try to actually play with in an aircraft. I don't know if you did it in the sim, but did the sim respond as if you were losing directional control if you got below red line?
Yeah, it definitely did. Yeah, and it was great. I mean, to be able to go up to we did it at a high altitude. I think we were up at 5,000 feet, and it worked just like the airplane.
Wow, good stuff. So everybody asks, how much is it going to cost me? These are still training topics, but everyone says, how much is it going to cost me to get my multi-engine rating? And there's this. In my mind, it's probably, if you're a current regular flying pilot, it's going to be somewhere between 7 and 10 hours of flight in the aircraft, and I think it just varies to how much you work on the ground. I've seen people fly 25 hours to get their multi-engine rating, and they never spend a second in the books. Right. They just keep getting in that aircraft, and while they're flying at 3,000 feet, the instructor simulates zero thrust, and they go through the flow. They do no chair flying. They do no ground. That's extremely expensive. I think if you did the book work and did the right amount of ground and did the right amount of homework, probably flew a sim or chair flew enough, I think anyone could get done between 7 and 10 hours in a light twin and be check ride ready. Does that sound about right for you, Wally?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to think of that. And you're going to go out and you've got to do some steep turns, you've got to do some stalls, you have to do an emergency descent, a VMC demonstration. We're going to shut down an engine, we're going to start one up, we're going to maneuver around on single engine, and then we have to do an engine out instrument approach if the applicant is instrument rated, and then we do an engine out takeoff, and we do a short and soft field takeoff, and we do a engine failure on the ground, so basically a rejected takeoff. So there's quite a bit. The typical multi-engine check ride is just a lot of maneuvers. The check ride can normally be done in about 1.8, something like that.
Yeah, and it was, I think mine was like 2 hours, and it's back to back to back. I mean, you're almost transitioning, from the rejected takeoff to a short field takeoff or a takeoff of some sort. Then you're climbing, and you get to altitude. You're starting your steep turns. You do all that. You climb up more. It's just back to back to back. It's just nonstop. It was quite fun, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think one people like about multi-engine training is there's no knowledge test involved in it. So you don't have to go take a written test. Now, does that make people think, well, there's no book work involved? Maybe it does. There's actually quite a bit of book work involved in multi-engine airplanes. And it's probably in airplane, a lot of flight schools, you might fly in a Cessna, and your multi-engine training might be in a Piper Seneca or a Beechcraft or something. So for a lot of people, it's a different type airplane than what they're accustomed to.
Everything's in a different spot. Every button's in a different place. It's maybe two ignition switches, of course, two alternator switches, two master switch, one master switch, but a lot of double duplication that you're not really used to, and fuel tank selectors, multiple. It's just a lot of effort. But again, I can't stress enough how much chair flying can be done and really resolve a lot of the flying components that you're practicing. What's a typical oral look like, I guess? If you could talk us through that real quick as an examiner for those that are out there listening. Really, it's kind of the knowledge that you're going to be, that the ACS requires you to talk through.
Yeah, well, I kind of put it into 3 buckets. We're going to talk a lot about multi-engine aerodynamics. And, the simple the basic aerodynamics are the same for every airplane, but when I say multi-engine aerodynamics, how does losing an engine affect us? And that's that whole rudder thing that we were talking about, the effectiveness of the rudder and getting so slow that the rudder can no longer maintain directional control. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. That's the VMC, velocity minimum control. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the systems in a multi-engine airplane, and we're also going to talk about performance. So there's maybe some different performance charts in a twin-engine airplane that we may not have. We have A lot of airplanes have what's called an accelerate stop distance, which tells us how much room, basically, to accelerate to take off speed and lose an engine and reject and come to a complete stop. How much runway we need for that. So there's some different aspects of that. And for a lot of people, they're used to flying a Piper, a Warrior, or something like that has manual flaps. Well, they may be in a multi-engine airplane, and now for the first time they're dealing with electric flaps. So there's the whole aspect of, well, what about an electrical failure? How do we get the gear down in an electrical failure? How do we get the flaps down with an electrical failure? And I'm going to give it away. The answer I'm looking for is the checklist. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to hear people say, and people kind of usually start going through procedures, and I say, yeah, okay, well, you may be right, you may be wrong, I don't know, but really what we want to do is we want to go through the checklist. And probably in most airplanes, if you have electric flaps and you have a total electrical failure, it's going to be a no-flap landing. So then we jump in the books and look to see if we have any data to support us on a no-flap landing. And the older airplanes don't have it. There is, if you look up how much runway do I need to land this airplane with no flaps, it's not in there. So what are we going to do? Are we going to add 10%? Are we going to add 100%? I don't know what the right answer is. But it's worth thinking about. Would we want, let's say our normal landing distance for our airplane is 1,500 feet, or that's what the book says, is that we need 1,500 feet to come to a stop, and we have no flaps. Are we going to land on a 3,000 foot long runway? I don't know.
Yeah, I remember the accelerated stop distance was something that was kind of surprising, just because as a single engine pilot, you never really even think about that or even contemplate. You've maybe thought at best about short field takeoffs and landings, but it was interesting that the short runway at hooks creates that margin of error next to nothing if you were to take that accelerated stop into account. And I just would never take off on the short runway if I don't have to, because of that margin of error being so small, and probably never land there unless it was almost an emergency, right? Or the runway was closed and I was running out of fuel. I mean, the landing's probably safer than the taking off in that case, but you only get really one shot at it, and one shot for sure if you're on one engine on the little runway.
Yeah, my first aviation job was working at as a lineman at a FBO and flight school, and we actually did pipeline patrol. And I remember talking to one of the pipeline pilots one day, and I said, man, it has to be so stressful flying around at 300 feet or whatever altitude they fly at. And he said to me, actually, it's not stressful, because if I lose the engine, there's no decision to be made. I'm going straight ahead, whether I like what I see or whether I don't like what I see, I'm going straight ahead. And it kind of made me think, and then you apply that to multi-engine flying. If we take off in a twin-engine airplane and we lose an engine, we might have some options. Do we keep flying, or do we just land it straight ahead, whether it be in a field or a golf course or whatever? We have some more options. Now, those options have gotten people in trouble because sometimes they've made decisions that they probably shouldn't have made. But we do have options in multi-engine airplanes.
Yeah, that was kind of eye-opening too, and everybody's opinion is a little different, much like our conversations around emergencies, right? Or is it really an emergency, and how far can I go on a single engine in my light twin? In Houston, almost sea level, on a nice day, I think single engine is around 33,500 in that plane. call it a hot day, we'll call it 2,500. I can probably maintain 2,500 if I have that single engine. I mean, I can fly a long way. I go a long way on a single engine at 2,500 all the time in a Cessna, right? So no reason why I couldn't get to hooks or get back to my home base. But there's all kinds of risk involved in that because now you are down to that last engine. I know I learned a lot. One of the things in twins that I think is fascinating is normally you hear about all the incidents that have occurred. It's normally not one engine that quits, Wally. I think that's the training scenario we use a lot, but why do both engines normally quit in multi-engines in the real world?
Well, it's usually a fuel issue.
Yeah, we've had one locally in the past couple of years that ran out of gas. It doesn't matter which engine, which dead foot. They're both dead. You got a dead engine on both sides, and for the one, that's the one reason I tell everybody I don't normally travel in the twin because it is really a training type device. The airspeed's about 7 knots, maybe true airspeed's 7 knots faster than my 182, and the 182 without power is going to probably land, be in a forced landing at 65 knots, and the Travel Air is going to land somewhere in the 90-ish, 92 mile per hour range if I want to stay above red line. So I'd much rather hit something at 60 than 90.
Right.
So the airspeed, the gain in airspeed is just not that much for all the fuel that I'm going to burn and all that other stuff that's going to come with it. But the options are really there. What do you see? Go ahead.
I was going to say, just statistically speaking, in a twin-engine airplane, you're twice as likely to have a engine failure than you are in a single-engine airplane.
Yeah, and it's not, unless you do the only flying that you do is in a multi. I mean, there's a lot of risk in flying a multi-engine aircraft once a quarter. Like, I never am current and proficient in that plane because I just don't fly it enough. And it's one of those things where because I don't fly it enough, it's harder to stay current in it. So I just don't really fly it that much. I got my rating and I dream and think I'm going to get proficient and fly it a bunch, but the options that I have are in my situation are a little different. So I might not ever stay current in it, but it is a nice aircraft. It would be nice to be able to fly it wherever I wanted to go.
Right.
What do you see in check rides? We did a bunch of check ride errors and common mistakes. We did 4 parts in the past. If you haven't heard those shows, go back and check them out. We covered private over 2 shows and instrument and commercial in their own shows. What do you see that is a struggle in the oral or maybe in the flying that we haven't had a chance to talk about in those other episodes?
Well, I'll tell you one thing I see in the flying portion. I see some instrument issues in the flying portion. Someone has difficulty flying an instrument approach. Well, if you're having trouble flying an instrument approach in a single-engine airplane, when we put you in a twin-engine airplane and then fail an engine and expect you to fly an instrument approach, it's going to be even tougher. So, depending on the situation, I see people coming in, and somebody may be, maybe they're a commercial helicopter pilot, and they fly a helicopter every day, and they've got their single engine, maybe commercial, maybe private, and they want to get their multi-engine rating. Well, a lot of times they're not used to the avionics that are in this multi-engine airplane. So a lot of their struggles aren't multi-engine issues. They're avionics issues that happen to be in this multi-engine airplane. And it's really disheartening to have to say, I'm sorry that this check ride was unsatisfactory because you couldn't figure out how to load the approach, or you couldn't figure out how to go direct to this intersection that ATC sent us to. And it's not a multi-engine airplane. It's a Garmin 430 issue or a 530 issue or whatever avionics you happen to have in the airplane. So from that standpoint, my suggestion would be is at least try to fly an airplane. Before you jump in a twin-engine airplane, fly an airplane that has very similar avionics, similar displays, whether it's a G5 or an Aspen or just traditional steam gauges or whatever it would happen to be. But be familiar with all that stuff before you jump in the airplane. And again, simulator can do all that for you.
Yeah, and I tell this a lot, and if anybody wants my recommendation, they can send me an email or a message on the social medias. After every onboarding or orientation in our school, I recommend somebody going out and buying X-Plane or Microsoft Flight Simulator and a reasonable joystick that I recommend every time. All in, you're talking $185. That's like half of any single engine lesson probably across the country, and you can use it forever on a recently purchased MacBook or Windows machine. You're going to be able to practice. They all have light twins. They all have single engine trainers, but they all have the avionics, which is the key. It might not say Garmin, but it's a 530 something that looks just like it. The menus are exactly the same. Maybe that's a copyright infringement that they're trying to protect, but the devices are all in those cockpits. Just pull that simulator software up and go through the menus. Know how to do the things that you're not proficient in. Not sitting in a plane that costs $300+ an hour to turn on.
Right. Yeah.
What about the oral is? I mean, people are pretty good. There's not much. They all go through their same acronym for the verification of VMC. I can't even think. It's like scum something. I don't remember what it was.
I don't even know what it was. I was never so much an acronym guy. I encourage instructors to, if they're going to use the acronyms, to use the acronyms after the fact. Teach them the material and then say, oh, by the way, here's a way to remember this. Because I do an instrument check ride and I say, okay, well, tell me when an alternator is required. And people say, well, it's the 1-2-3 rule. I go, well, what's the 1-2-3 rule? And sometimes they struggle with it. I'm thinking, man, they can throw out the 1-2-3 rule, but what does it mean? I don't know. For the most part, the orals go pretty well. I can't think of anybody that has struggled too much. I think if you go through the POH of your airplane and again, the systems may be a little bit different. The heaters are probably a little bit different in most multi-engine airplanes. It's not your typical single engine where we're taking heat from around the exhaust. It's usually a different type heating system. We get into the fuel system because a lot of these airplanes will have more than just one tank per engine. You might have aux tanks. And we may have cross-feeding capability, so if we did have to fly a long distance on one engine, we could get fuel from the other side over to that engine. So we'll spend some time talking about the fuel system. Again, everybody, if you've ever listened, electrical systems are kind of my passion. So we'll talk about, what happens if we lose an alternator. Is the other alternator capable of doing everything we need it to do? In most cases it is, but we may have to monitor electrical loads and maybe shut things off, but probably not. I think overall the ground portions go fairly well.
Good. I do remember my instrument approach. I was a pretty proficient instrument pilot, but it's amazing how that failure and everything kind of comes together just at the right time as you're being handed off to that local ATC or maybe to the tower, and it's this overload, right? So if you aren't just super proficient, I can almost predict wherever you're at in the world, your engine's going to fail right about that time you're getting handed off, and creates just a little bit more stress. Yeah. But all in all, I think at this point, most people have 250 to 350 hours. I won't call it a checkbox, but it's probably a checkbox for most of the pilots out there that are going to the airlines. They want to get their rating and they want to get their 15. Is it 15 hours to be eligible for an ATP? PSE?
Yeah, I don't even know.
I think it is 15 now. Yeah. It's not much, but they pretty much are going to get their rating and split 15 hours with someone and build that time and go on and fly jets. But it is a treat to fly the Twin. It's heavier. It's not as bumpy. It's much more enjoyable. If you want to be a much better pilot, I highly recommend adding that rating to your repertoire and becoming a better pilot. It will definitely do so. We didn't even get into critical engines and all the other things that come with that today, but maybe we'll do a part 2 down the road and do a little bit more training as it relates to multi-engines. But for today we'll wrap it up. As always, fly safely, and in this case, stay behind the props.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.